Hürtgen Forest, late November 1944. A Wehrmacht engineering officer is in a fortified pine canopy bunker, 4 years deep into a war he is now slowly losing. He is 40 years old. He has commanded fortifications since France in 1940. His sector here is 600 meters of interlocking machine gun fire, log-reinforced positions, and bunkers his men spent 6 weeks digging into the slope. We are looking at this scene through his eyes, because that is the only way to understand what is about to happen to him. The Americans across the line have been throwing themselves at this canopy for weeks. They are losing thousands of men a day, and they are being chewed apart by tree-burst artillery the German line knows how to use better than they do. The Americans have a name for these woods, the Death Factory. He has reasons to think his line will hold, because his line has held against everything our boys have thrown at him. He is right about every reason except one. Then the sky catches fire. 60 tongues of flame from the American side in rapid succession. Trees splintering into wooden shrapnel inside the canopy. Bunkers collapsing under impacts. 4 seconds, and the German line has lost its first 100 yards of frontage. This is the impossibility we plant within 90 seconds of the open. Men who have survived 4 years of conventional artillery find themselves facing something that offers no time to seek cover, no pause between impacts, no warning that might save their lives. The roar is continuous. The smoke trails cross and recross above the pines. Each warhead carries the explosive equivalent of a 105mm howitzer shell, and the rocket launcher above the Sherman fires 60 of them while the gunner counts to 4. The Wehrmacht had Nadelwerfer rocket batteries on the Eastern Front for 3 years. They had the Nadelwerfer 42 on a half-track chassis. The German engineering officer in this bunker has heard rocket fire many times in his career. He has never heard rocket fire that arrives all at once. The weapon that did this was a Sherman tank, an American medium tank, with 60 steel tubes welded over the turret. The Americans called it the Calliope, after the steam organ at country fairs and circuses, because the rack of tubes looked like an organ on a battlefield. By the time German prisoners were walking back to the rear, our boys had a name for the woods too. They called it a place where their dead lay among the broken pines, because thousands of our infantry had been broken in those trees before the Calliope ever arrived. They had earned the right to name it. They had paid for the right. Here is what no German officer realized that morning. The weapon that broke their canopy line had not been built in Detroit. It had not been designed by any army officer, and it had not come down from any general's desk in Washington. It came from a civilian physics lab in Pasadena, where a Norwegian-born immigrant nuclear physicist had spent the war running an enterprise that produced every American 4.5-inch rocket fired anywhere in the world. The lab in Pasadena did not appear on any German order of battle. It did not appear on any American one either, because the men who ran it did not work that way. We will name it now. Stay with us for a moment, because what you are about to see in the next 6 minutes is how a civilian university lab with no military rank and no uniformed officer in charge became the single largest producer of American rocket weapons in the Second World War. The man who ran it was a Caltech physicist who had spent the 1930s healing cancer patients with radiation he had invented himself. He was 49 years old when the Atlantic War began. He was 53 when his rockets broke the German canopy line at Hurtgen. He never wore a uniform, Charles Christian Lauritsen. Born Holstebro, Denmark, the 4th of April, 1892. He came to America in 1916 and worked first as a radio engineer in St. Louis. He arrived at Caltech in 1926 to study physics under Robert Millikan. He earned his physics doctorate at Caltech under Millikan in 1929, and he naturalized as an American citizen the same year. He built one of the first million-volt X-ray tubes in the world, the Sloan-Lauritsen tube, named for him and his collaborator David Sloan, and he pioneered medical radiation therapy at Caltech through the 1930s. The man who would arm the Sherman at Hurtgen had spent the 1930s healing cancer patients with the same radiation his lab would later use to design rocket motor diagnostics. The May 1941 OSRD delegation, Lauritsen is 49 years old, a civilian with no military credential, a Norwegian-Danish immigrant who's been an American citizen for 12 years. He flies to Britain on an OSRD delegation that Vannevar Bush has personally cleared. The Blitz peaked 14 months earlier, and the anti-aircraft barrage balloons still hang over the London docks. The British have been at war with Germany for 20 months. They have lost the Channel. They have not lost the air. He watches British rocket weapons fired in operational use against German targets. He watches the rockets land. He watches what they do to the men they hit. He takes notes in a Caltech notebook with a No. 2 pencil he brought with him from Pasadena. William Fowler, who would later write Lauritsen's biography for the National Academy of Sciences in 1969, recorded what happened next in plain language. Lauritsen came home convinced America had to have its own rocket program, because what he had watched in Britain in May 1941 told him the Atlantic War would be a rocket war whether the Americans were ready for it or not. He pressed for it. He did not stop pressing. Pearl Harbor was still 7 months in the future when Lauritsen returned from London with a conviction the rest of the country would not learn for another half year. He pressed Vannevar Bush. He pressed Bush's National Defense Research Committee. He pressed every senior figure in OSRD who would take a meeting with a civilian physicist who had not been asked to come. By 1942, he was chair of NDRC Division 3, headquartered at Caltech and renamed Section H in the OSRD reorganization the following year. By 1944, his lab employed over 1,000 people. At its peak, his civilian payroll supported $100 million a month in Navy rocket procurement. A medical radiation lab at a university in Pasadena was now the largest rocket weapons enterprise in the United States, because Lauritsen had walked into Bush's office in 1941 and refused to leave until Bush had agreed to fund a Caltech rocket section. The Caltech section did not look like a weapons plant when you walked through it. It looked like a university physics building. The hallways smelled of solder and machine oil. The men in the rooms wore tweed jackets and rolled-up shirt sleeves, and they ran rocket motor static tests behind a concrete blast wall they had built themselves. They were graduate students before the war. They were professors. They were instrument makers from the Caltech machine shop. By 1943, the Caltech section was the largest single OSRD operation by personnel count, and Lauritsen ran it the way a department chair runs a department, because he had been running departments since the early 30s, and that was the management style he knew. He hired women into the rocket program because qualified men were scarce, and the women he hired stayed in technical roles after the war, which was unusual for Caltech in 1945. He worked 16-hour days. He never raised his voice. The men in the program said later that they had never seen him angry and they had never seen him uncertain. But Section H did not build the launcher that arrived at Hurtgen. Section H built the rocket. The launcher came from another American lineage entirely. A soldier alone at the Maryland Proving Ground who had been waiting for this war since 1932. Aberdeen, Proving Ground, Maryland. 1932. Captain Leslie A. Skinner. Born San Francisco, the 21st of April, 1900. West Point class of 24. MIT master's degree. Skinner was the only solid-propellant rocket researcher in the entire United States Armed Forces, and he was a one-man operation in a small workshop on the Aberdeen range. The Army of the 1930s was focused on conventional artillery, on tanks, on aircraft. Rockets were the stuff of pulp magazines and Sunday supplement science. Skinner's superiors thought rockets were an interesting diversion at best, a complete waste at worst, and they let him work because he asked for very little money and almost no men. He ran on personal funds, on discarded materials, on parts he begged from passing artillery officers. He kept the flame of American rocketry alive almost single-handedly through the years his country had no use for him. His enthusiasm for rockets had nearly ended his military career before it began. In 1915, as a 15-year-old at Fort Strong in Massachusetts, Skinner's homemade rocket experiments had set fire to the post-hospital roof. The blaze caused considerable damage and very nearly persuaded the army that this particular boy should not be in uniform. He went on to West Point anyway. He went on to the Academy in 24, and he went on to MIT after that, and he went on to Aberdeen in 32. And the rocket that had burned the Fort Strong hospital roof in 1915 was the same family of rocket that would burn the Hurtgen canopy line in 1944. He had been working on the same problem for almost 30 years. He had been preparing for a war that did not yet exist, with weapons no one in the American military believed in. The diversion was him. Skinner's other claim to fame would come from the same workshop. He co-developed the bazooka with Edward Uhl during the war's first year. The bazooka, the M9 rocket launcher, carried by the American infantry riflemen from Tunisia to Okinawa, was Skinner's other rocket. He gave us the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon and the heavy artillery rocket in the same workshop in the same calendar year, because his 1930s dormancy had given him the room to think about every scale of rocket the American military would eventually need. He did not get rich. He did not write a memoir. His name appears in unit histories and ordnance reports and almost nowhere else. When war came, Skinner needed cylindrical casings for his rocket prototypes. Wartime priorities meant no factory would machine custom tubes. Every manufacturer in America was scrambling to produce equipment for an army that was expanding faster than anyone had anticipated. And custom rocket casings sat at the bottom of every priority list. Every priority list. So, Skinner used what was available. Old surplus fire extinguisher tanks, 4.5 inches in diameter, in surplus quantity, sitting in a quartermaster's depot in Maryland because no one had a better use for them. That accident, on a hardware shelf in 1941, fixed the caliber of every American rocket built around the M8 motor for the next 15 years. A dimension that defined American rocket artillery into the Korean War was set by what an army captain found on a surplus shelf, because there was no other tube within driving distance that he could afford to cut up and weld into a rocket body. The 6th of July, 1942. A Curtiss P-40 Echo over the Aberdeen test range fires the first successful M8 air launch. The rocket flies straight, the fins bite, the trajectory holds. Within hours, Army Ordnance places an order for 600,000 units. By the end of the war, American factories will produce 2.5 million M8 rockets, and they will fire them out of Lauritsen's truck launchers, out of the tank-mounted Calliope, out of P-47 Thunderbolts in Europe, and out of Hellcats and Corsairs over the Pacific. The Fire-Extinguisher Caliber, that began as a captain's improvisation, became the most produced rocket of the American war because Skinner had been waiting since 1932 for the moment when his diversion would not be a diversion any longer. The rocket was Lauritsen and Skinner. The launcher was a third stream. The United States Army Ordnance Department, 1943, formally designated the T34 Calliope. 60 rocket tubes mounted on top of the Sherman turret. 36 permanent tubes in the upper section. 2 jetisonable groups of 12 in the lower. The launcher tied directly into the Sherman's 75mm main gun barrel through a pivoting arm and a split-ring clamp. The tank commander aimed the rockets the same way he aimed the gun, and he fired them electrically through cables running into the turret through the commander's hatch. He stayed inside the buttoned-up tank while 60 rockets in 4 seconds left the rack above his head. 3 institutions, 3 streams, 1 weapon. Remove any one stream and the Calliope does not exist. Remove the Caltech rocket motor and Aberdeen has a frame around nothing. Remove Skinner's Caliber accident and Caltech has a propellant problem and no body to load it into. Remove Army Ordnance's launcher engineering and Caltech has a stockpile that no Sherman crew can use. There is one more thread almost no one names. 1844. William Hale, an American inventor, U.S. patent number 3711. The 1844 patent was an improvement in rockets, and it replaced the British Congreve stick with internal vane spin stabilization. Hale rockets were fielded with the United States Army in Mexico in 1847, and they reached the gates of Mexico City in the same campaign that gave us Veracruz and Chapultepec. Then American military rocketry went dormant for 75 years after the Civil War, sleeping in patent office files until Skinner woke it at Aberdeen in 1932. The Calliope at Hurtgen continued an American rocket lineage exactly 100 years old, because the patent in the file from 44 had not been a dead idea. It had been a sleeping one. Spring 1944. The Calliope and its sister system, the T-40 whiz-bang, have been built specifically for the Normandy invasion against German beach bunkers. The plan is simple, and it is in every staff document in England that month. Calliope-equipped Shermans roll off the landing craft, climb the beach line, and saturate the bunkers with 60 rocket salvos, before the infantry climbs the bluffs behind them. Engineers from Caltech and Aberdeen flew to England in March and April to validate the systems for the Channel crossing. The orders were waiting. The rockets were stockpiled in southern English depots. The launchers had been bolted to Shermans in those depots with the bolts torqued to specification and the wiring tested twice. What they found made them refuse to ship. 1,840 pounds of launcher mounted high above the turret made the Sherman dangerously top-heavy on the pitching decks of a landing craft tank in heavy chop. A Sherman with a Calliope rack rode visibly higher than its standard sisters, and the Channel crossing forecast was for chop and weather. The whiz-bang in firing tests threatened the launcher crew themselves with stray rocket fragments. Both weapons were pulled from the D-Day order of battle by their own makers, because the men who built them refused to ship a launcher that would kill its own Sherman crew on the Channel crossing before the crew ever reached the beach. They had been given the order. They had read the staff documents. They returned the order with their objections in writing. June 6, 1944. 06:30 hours. Allied forces are storming Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. Men are dying on the sand at a rate that will reach 2,000 by sundown. In a damp English depot, every Calliope launcher box ever built, the most heavily engineered American rocket weapon of the war up to that morning, sits on a wooden pallet, chalked numbers on the crate, untouched. The depot is silent. The pallets are stacked. The light comes in sideways through high windows, because the men who designed the launcher and the men who built it would not ship a weapon that would kill its own Sherman crew on the Channel crossing. They had been told to ship. They refused. The most spectacular American rocket weapon of the war never made the most important amphibious assault in history. It sat in a Dorset depot waiting for a battle that was going to come ashore without it, because integrity in an engineer is the kind of thing that costs a beach. August. The siege of Brest in Brittany. 40,000 German troops under Paratroop General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, who intends to hold the port until every facility is denied to Allied logistics. The Brittany Peninsula has been cut off by Patton's Third Army through July, and Brest is the last working German harbour on the Atlantic coast of France. American units finally test a smaller T-27 xylophone truck-mounted rocket launcher in combat for the first time. The 2nd Infantry Division rates the system unsatisfactory. Single launchers cannot saturate. Rockets scatter too widely to breach a specific bunker. The decision is made to pair launchers and concentrate fire. Because the Calliope concept is sound and the implementation is wrong, and because a Caltech engineer in Pasadena who had not been to Brest could read the after-action report from a desk and see what had happened. The Brest report goes back to Aberdeen, and the Aberdeen report goes back to Caltech, and the next launcher cycle begins. This is the OSRD model in 2 sentences. Civilian engineers correct civilian engineers. The Army does not write the spec. The Army uses the spec. Autumn 1944, Hürtgen Forest. Conventional artillery shells are detonating in the pine canopy and showering American troops below with wooden shrapnel. American infantry casualties are mounting daily, and the daily replacement line is shorter than the daily casualty list. And finally, the Calliope launcher boxes that sat in English depots through the most important amphibious assault in history are bolted onto Sherman turrets and rolled forward, 6 months late. To a battle, the Americans were nearly losing. To a forest, the Americans had named the Death Factory. The first salvos arrive in November. They land where the conventional artillery cannot reach. because the rockets fall vertically through the canopy onto the bunker line, and a vertical rocket impact drives a 105mm equivalent through pine and into reinforced timber. The Wehrmacht response is in psychological warfare records. 3 Calliopes per division, the after-action report said. The Germans believed there were hundreds. The verbatim primary source named officer interrogation, the Wehrmacht voice itself in its own words, sits in NARA record group 226 and record group 319, Saarland March of 1945, in interrogation summaries that have been on the shelf since the war ended in May of 45. We have requested them. We will name him when the archive answers, because we will not invent a German officer when there is a real one waiting in a folder. December 1944. The 743rd Tank Battalion, attached to the 30th Infantry Division, receives 30 M4 Shermans fitted with T34 Calliope sets. The battalion practices loading. The battalion practices firing. Then, the German Ardennes offensive breaks on the 16th of December, and the launchers are stripped from the tanks before the battalion moves into the fight, because the bulge fighting is no place for an unstable rocket Sherman against German Tigers in defile. The fitted launchers go back into depot. The Sherman crews go forward as standard tanks. No Calliope salvo will be fired in 1944. The first sustained Calliope combat firing in the European theatre will not happen until February. Stripping the racks off the 743rd's tanks 2 days before the bulge was the right call. It was also a quiet admission that the rocket Sherman, in December 1944, was frankly not going to be a bulge weapon, because nobody had stress-tested the launcher in winter mud against Tigers in defile, and nobody was going to find out the hard way with 30 M4s on a road to St. Vith. The OSRD model says you do not field a launcher you have not tested in the conditions that you are about to ask of it. The Army Ordnance officers who pulled the racks understood the model. They were not happy about it. They pulled the racks anyway. February and March 1945, Saarland. General Patton's 3rd Army breaks through the west wall on the road to the Rhine. The 12th Armoured Division's Tank Battalion 714 Fields Calliope crews. The 14th Armoured Division's Tank Battalion 40 rolls into Obermodern with the launcher rack fully laden, and the United States Signal Corps photographs it in March of 1945. That photograph survives in catalogue today. You can pull it up, you can read the unit designation chalked on the side of the M4A3. The men in the picture are 19 and 20 years old, and they are standing next to a weapon that came down a chain that runs back to a Caltech physicist's office in Pasadena and an Army captain's surplus fire-extinguisher tank in Maryland. Patton's Saarland campaign would be the operational moment for the Calliope because the west wall was a built-up position with concrete bunkers spaced for interlocking fire, and a rocket tank could break those bunkers faster than tube artillery could register against them. The rocket fell vertically. The artillery shell came in at angle. The bunker roof was thick on the inclined plane and thin on the top, and the Calliope salvo went in the top. That was why the 12th Armoured fielded it. That was why the 14th fielded it. That was why the men in the Obermodern photograph are standing next to a tank with a rack on it, and not next to a standard Sherman, on a March day 8 weeks before the war in Europe ended. Glenn Cowboy Lamb, 1st Platoon, Company C, Tank Battalion 714, 12th Armoured Division. Lamb's son Joe later donated his father's account, and Tank Encyclopedia preserved it on the page that bears the photograph of an Obermodern Sherman. The account is one of the few first-person Calliope crew narratives that has reached open archive at all, because most of the men who fielded the launcher did not write down what they had done. Lamb did. His best friend was the driver of his Calliope tank. The Germans had learned to recognize the rack at a kilometer's distance because the silhouette was unmistakable from a long way off. Standard Shermans went down a German road unscathed. The Calliope came up behind them. A 20mm flak gun lying in ambush along that road did not open fire on the standard Shermans. It waited. It opened fire only when the rocket rack was in its sights. Lamb's friend lost his head. Lamb watched it happen from the next vehicle in the column. He told the story to his son many times across 30 years of his post-war life. His son recorded the version we have now. The Library of Congress, Veterans History Project, holds oral histories indexed by name and unit. The Patton Museum at Fort Benning holds its own crew oral histories from the European theatre. We have asked both archives whether they hold a Calliope crewman's testimony beyond Lamb's. The reply is pending. The script you are listening to was written before the reply arrived, and the version that goes up will name a second crewman by name only when the folder names him first. The Calliope drew fire because it worked. 200 launcher systems were ever produced for the entire war. Limited procurement designation, never standard issue. A vanishing fraction of the 50,000 Shermans in service. And every reload of those 60 tubes took 2 crewmen 2 hours, performed on top of an exposed armor deck, often under fire. The men who fielded the Calliope knew exactly what they were riding into, and they rode in anyway, because the math at Hurtgen and Saarland said the salvo paid for the silhouette. They could break a bunker line that conventional artillery could not break. They could open a road in 2 seconds at a cost the war's accounting was prepared to enter on the ledger. They paid the cost. There is no clean way to phrase that. The crews knew the silhouette drew fire and rolled into it anyway, and most of them came home. And the ones who did not are the price the canopy line was bought for. They were our boys. The phrase belongs in this script because they were ours. And because the math at Hurtgen, when you write it out without sentiment, says the Calliope salvo on a German bunker line saved more American infantry than the rocket tank lost crewmen. That is the math. That is the only math that mattered to the men who climbed into those Shermans with the rack on top. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the 743rd Tank Battalion attached to the 30th Infantry Division, the 712th, the 752nd, the 753rd, or the 781st Tank Battalions in Italy and the European theatre, the 12th Armoured Division's 714th Tank Battalion, the 14th Armoured Division's 40th Tank Battalion at Obermodern, the 2nd, the 4th, or the 6th Armoured Divisions in Saarland, or the 2nd Infantry Division at the Siege of Brest. They were the men who took Caltech's rocket and made it real on the road to the Rhine. Tell us about them in the comments. Their names belong in the record too. A like on this video keeps that memory alive. It takes 1 second, but it matters, because there will be a day when the men who served in those battalions will not be here to tell us themselves, and the only record we will have is the one we keep. May of 1945. The Calliope fires its last combat rounds as German resistance collapses across the Reich. By June, the launchers are stripped from Sherman tanks and stacked in depot warehouses. Most will be scrapped within 2 years. A few survive in museums in Texas and Kentucky as curiosities the docents do not always explain correctly. The men who built them at Caltech and Aberdeen never made the case publicly that they had won anything, because the men who built them did not work that way. They had built a weapon. They had handed it to soldiers. The soldiers had used it. That, to them, was the end of the story. The men who fielded the Calliope, the 743rd and the 12th Armoured and the 14th Armoured and the rest came home and went back to civilian work. They did not get a parade. They did not get a campaign streamer with a rocket on it. The Calliope was never a campaign streamer. It was a limited procurement designation. The men knew that the day they were issued the rack, and the men knew it the day they parked the tanks at Fort Knox or Camp Hood after the war. They went back to garages and farms and machine shops in Indiana and Ohio and Texas and Kentucky, and they told their wives and their children parts of the story, and the parts they told became the parts we know. Lauritsen returned to Caltech in the autumn of 45. He did not write a memoir. When OSRD asked someone to author its official history, he declined because writing about what he had done was not his job and never had been. The job went to John Burchard in 1948, and Lauritsen's name appears in chapters 7 through 11 of Burchard's official OSRD history without a single self-account, without a single Lauritsen by line, without a single page that says Lauritsen describes anywhere in the text. He served on Eisenhower's Science Advisory Committee through the 1950s. He resumed nuclear physics with his son Thomas. He never told the public story of what he built. Fowler, in the National Academy memoir, would summarize Lauritsen's silence in one sentence. He had done the work. He saw no reason to describe it. The Caltech section closed quietly. The blast walls came down. The static test rigs were dismantled. The graduate students went back to dissertations on cosmic rays. The 1,000-person rocket payroll evaporated inside 90 days because OSRD contracts terminated on the calendar date of war's end, and the Caltech bursar's office had a stack of pink slips ready before VJ Day. The 4.5-inch rocket motor lived on for 15 more years in NATO inventories, fired in Korea, kept on the shelf in Europe, and never again loaded into a tank-top launcher because no army after 1945 wanted a tank-top launcher again. The HVAR 5-inch rocket that Lauritsen's section had also produced, the Holy Moses, fired off Navy carrier fighters and Marine Corps Corsairs through Korea and into the early Vietnam decade. And that rocket, too, came out of a quiet office in Pasadena where the man who had ordered it built had gone back to teaching graduate students about the inside of an atom. This is the reckoning. Lauritsen died in Pasadena the 13th of April, 1968, 76 years old, surrounded by his sons and his graduate students. The Sherman crews of Hurtgen and Saarland are buried in cemeteries from Henri Chapelle to Saint-Avold, with no Calliope on their headstones. The weapon that broke the Death Factory came from a place no one in Germany or America ever named on a map, because the man who built it asked for no monument and the men who fired it had no time to ask why their tank silhouette drew the flak gun first. That was always how he wanted it. That was always how they fought it. The lab in Pasadena had built a rocket. The captain at Aberdeen had built a launcher tube out of a fire extinguisher. The patent in the file from 1844 had given them the spin-stabilized airframe 100 years before any of them needed it. Our boys at Hurtgen had carried the whole thing forward. And the record, when the archives answer in full, will say what we already know. The Calliope worked because 3 streams of American invention had converged on it. And one of those streams ran out of a quiet Caltech office that no German officer in any forest knew to name. The rest of the reckoning waits in a folder. We will read it when it arrives. The men in the Obermodern photograph deserve nothing less.